whatever. That's when I graduated. So, you know, professors did radical things like, you know, write on a chalkboard and consult notes and talk to the students, and you know, all that sort of, I don't know, I guess that's out of favor now. But anyway, so it turns out that lots of professors are using PowerPoint because for whatever reason. Maybe the business school is responsible. I have no idea. But anyway, people started writing me. They're like, Daryl, this is great. I'm going to use this for my class. I was like, what do you mean for your class? Anyway, so I found out. I took it to, at that point, I took it to what we could call version 1.0. Which, I'm sorry, that was version 1.0. I shouldn't have gotten rid of that. Which also had things in it like, you can't really see it because of the color values, but there's a 4/11 here. That's you are on slide X of Y indication. So it's telling you you're on this slide number out of this many total slides. Not counting the title slide. I actually count the title slide 0, and I don't put it in that total just because that's how I am. So, you know, this, I had been thinking about doing this, and then Steve Champion, who I mentioned in my 10 o'clock talk, actually, he and Nick Fink had, Digital Web Magazine, had put together their own slideshow system apparently at some point. And Nick emailed me and said, wow, that's just like the thing Steve and I did. And I said, wow, you and Steve did a thing? I didn't know that. But I went in and I looked at it and discovered it had this X of Y thing, so I stole their code and gave them credit, basically. And then he emailed them and said, thanks, I stole your code. Now, there were some changes on the back end here. Originally, I had just taken context markup and had used that because it made sense. I mean, you know, div class equals slide. I mean, how much more do you really need at that point than div class equals slide? And if you go down and you look, I mean, it looks very much like what Tantek was doing. You know, div class equals slide. It's just I'm missing that explicit ID because the JavaScript's doing it dynamically. And you know, however much I might hate PowerPoint, apparently I can't. At this point, anyway, I wasn't able to break myself out of the every slide must have bullet points the way of thinking. But I mean, you know, look, it's an unordered list, and each list item is a list. You know, it's very, very straightforward. And you can write it in BBEdit, which is pretty much my acid test for any good technology at this stage. Well, any good web technology, excuse me, at this stage. So, as it turned out, this div class equals slide is also how the Opera Show format, version 1.0, is set up. Mark Schenk, in conjunction with Opera, had written down effectively a specification for a slideshow format. So that by having this slideshow format that people could use, then people could write editors to write Opera Show presentations, and then it was all, you know, they were basically agreeing on a format for slideshows. Well, the markup Tantek had used, and that I was using, was basically 90% compatible with the Opera Show format. I believe by happenstance, because having talked with Tantek, I don't think he looked at I don't think he knew that Opera Show format existed, actually, until sometime after S5 had come out. Some changes that I had to make, though. I was originally doing all of my slide titles as H2s. The Opera Show format said H1s. And I discussed it with Mark Schenk for a while, and then eventually I decided, all right, I want to be OSF 1.0 compatible. So I'm going to go with the H1s for the titles. And we could get into this whole thing about, you know, the semantics of multiple H1s versus only one H1 and have the H2s. And I don't really want to go there because I don't care that much. This works, and it's great. But that drove some other considerations, such as in the Opera Show format, all of the slides are wrapped in a div with a class of presentation. And then before that, there's a div with a class of layout that has, you can put in layout stuff. So I use those. And that's where I stuck things like the div for the current slide indicator. All of the content's dynamically inserted by the JavaScript into this current slide, but I needed to have the structural hook. So I created it here. The same thing, well, the header, I don't put anything in the header for this particular format, but I could. Here's the footer. And then a lot of the stuff up here, a lot of this meta information like generator, version, pres date, author, and company, those were all just taken from the Opera Show format. They already had these things defined, and I didn't have any reason not to put them in, basically, and I had every reason to put them in order to be OSF 1.0 compatible, so I did. Now, this is really what makes S5 work right here. You have links to the slides, the CSS for the slides, and then, well, you have a link for the slide CSS, and then there's a link to opera.css. The system is set up so that if you're using Opera, it will fall back to Opera Show. Okay, it won't try to impose S5 basically, as S5 has browser detects, because it kind of has to, for this. It looks to see, hey, am I being run in Opera? And if the answer is yes, then it brings in this opera.css, which is an Opera Show, where's the, there it is, media equals projection, is an Opera Show style sheet. It has things like div.slide, page break before, always, which sets up the slide barriers. And the JavaScript just basically, once it did, the JavaScript, the root function basically says, is this Opera? Great, I'm done. I'm not going to run any other code. No more JavaScript. I'm just stepping out. Whereas if it is, if it isn't Opera, then it keeps going. And then there's I have a print style sheet in here as well, so that if you print out the document, you get the outline view with a few extra bits. Okay. So at that point, fabulous. That's great, for what it is. I mean, if you want a presentation system and you want to do it in this kind of a setup, that's nice. But as you can see here, it does have a few limitations. For example, if you happen to author your style sheet assuming 1024 by 768, and you get an 800 by 600, your content starts to get cut off because there's no font scaling, basically. And there isn't an easy way to get to it because this is all driven using positioning. Now, at the time I put out S5, I was like, this is still a DIY system, people. Know the CSS, because if you have to change the font size, you're going to have to know where to go into the CSS to change the value of font size for the body element. Okay. Yeah. Considering that originally I had assumed that anyone who ever used it would know CSS about as well as I did and would understand all, I mean, that was, like I said, originally I was like, yeah, Zeldman and those guys, they'll use a Molly Holschlag, she'll think it's great, Eventually, Dave Weiner will explain why it sucks, and I'll have arrived. So, then all these people were emailing me, and they're like, is there any way, what happens if a slide is too long, or if the resolution changes, all the stuff gets cut off? I was like, yeah, I know. You people weren't supposed to be using that. I didn't know. I mean, sure, you could scale, you could zoom the font in your browser, and you could do that regardless. But how many people know that function exists? Not enough, in my opinion. So, I had set all this up, and then, there are worse things to happen to your project than to discover it's popular, but there are also better things to happen in terms of having free time. So a lot of this stuff, there was some stuff in the JavaScript that was contributed by users that really, this wouldn't have been possible, honestly, without what they contributed. A good example is, here's where we set up some of the browser detects. And actually, if we jump down to the end of the JavaScript, basically, if I'm not Opera, do all this other stuff. But if I'm Opera, if it's Opera, basically, well, if you're not Opera, create the controls. No matter who you are, label all the slides, which is where it adds all the IDs dynamically. And then if you're not Opera, do all this other stuff. And all that other stuff is what sets up basically the system. But here's a function that someone contributed called isParent_or_self, which was kind of important because what was discovered during the beta process was that if you weren't careful, basically while trying to select this option here, you could advance the slide. Because basically there was an on-click event that was listening for clicks. And so you would click and it would say, ooh, the mouse is down. Advanced slides. Like, no, that's not, and things like that would happen where you would maybe click on one of these and it would double advance. Because it would pick up the click and then it would pick up the, hey, something advanced here. Things like that. So isParent_or_self was set up to say, was set up so that I could say, okay, if a parent of the thing that I clicked on is a certain element, then don't try to advance the slide. Stuff like that, which eventually became sort of these generic classes, well, not classes, functions, along with get elements with class name, which is something that actually a colleague and I wrote back in my days at Netscape. Not that we're the only ones who ever did it, of course. I mean, plenty of people have written this function or functions like it. But these sorts of things started to build up at the top of the script as just handy things to have. Function is class, which was a way of saying, hey, does this element have this particular class? And if so, do X, otherwise do Y. Which was great. I mean, the community involvement really helped. But what also helped was, in my experience, providing this kind of information, a diagram of the file structure. I wrote a primer, a very basic primer on creating your own S5 file. Basically, it's, you don't have not how to do a theme, but how to structure the content. So that it said, okay, every slide is in a div with a class of slide, and then you can put whatever you want in there, but bear in mind that if you have too much stuff, it's going to go off the bottom. And those sorts of things. Also, a complete structural reference that explained what every single possible element in the entire file structure could do, and it also indicated where things were OSF 1.0 compatible. And those were really important because rather than someone having to reverse engineer what I had written and what users had contributed, they could just look at these references and get a good starting point. And it actually helped. A couple of people already have written what are effectively S5 creators. They're slideshow creators that are just available online where you can use markdown syntax or a very simple syntax to, just you set your bullet points as asterisk, space, and then content and asterisk, and that sort of syntax, and then you click the turn it into a presentation for me button, and the system turns it into an S5 presentation, which is really nice. So, this sort of thing where it describes what each of these files is for. Things like S5 core.css, which has a comment at the top that says, mess with this and the sky will fall on your head, kind of thing. It's not exactly what it says. I actually got that from WordPress, but something like that. It's like, don't touch these unless you absolutely know what you're doing, and then if it breaks, don't cry. Or at least not to me. Any questions about how we got to where we were at this stage? No? I've either put them to sleep or they're just along for the ride. Okay. So at that point, because there was interest in it, I actually decided, it's going to have a version 1.1. So here's an example of version 1.1 with a different theme called I18N. Map of the world. Some of you got that joke. That's fine. Which, I mean, the markup